Morning, folks. It's Thursday, March 31st. So I guess we get out of March, we're going to have some good weather coming tomorrow. So hopefully. This morning, we're going to be taking testimony in regards to House Bill 626. And it's an act relating to the sale and use or application of neonicotinoid pesticides. And so we've got dealers, we've got people that manufacture this, and I would expect there's some people that like this stuff, and some people would rather not see it used. So we're going to be listening, and this is a bill that of course came to us from the health side, and we'll be dealing with it within the next couple of weeks, one way or another. And I know some of you are calling from quite a ways away, and some are on time limits. And so I think the way we've got this set up is Jacob or Cubby Bordeaux from Bordeaux Brothers will be our first witness, and then we'll go down the list. So I guess if you would like to tell us a little about how you use that, handle it, the farmers that buy it from you, you know, the process, that would be good, Cubby. So welcome, and we'll run around the room quickly and introduce ourselves. Chris
Pearson from Chittenden County.
Brian Collmore from the Rutland District.
Anthony Polina from Washington County.
Corey Parent from Franklin County.
And I'm Bobby Starr from Orleans County. So good morning and welcome, and Cubby, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning. I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you guys this morning, and I thank you for giving me a few minutes to go over some of this stuff. I think, for perspective's sake, I can offer you two different perspectives. One from ag industry as a reseller of neonics, and one as a farmer. I'm 46 years old. I started working with my dad, probably planting corn when I was 10 or 12 years old. And so I've kind of got the perspective of what we did before neonics, how we handle it today. But starting out from an industry standpoint, we started selling neonics, I'm going to guess 15 plus years ago, as an option. They were presented to us to sell as an option or a replacement to seed packets that we used to sell a small little packet of seed. A guy would dump his bag of corn in his planter, and then he would dump an envelope of insecticide and mix it in with his seed to give him insect protection from small insects, seed corn maggots, wireworms, grubs, to protect his seed from insects when first planting. When neonics became an option for us, we pretty quickly made a transition to offering that to our customers, and most customers found it to be a way more effective means of protecting their seed against insects, compared to this little packet that they tried to mix in on their own. Over the course of the 15 years, we went from selling no neonic protected seed to today selling 99.9% of our seed is all pre-treated. We offer seed to customers in two different levels of neonic treatment. One is what we term as a low rate insecticide, which would protect from the insects that I just mentioned, plus others, but mainly seed corn maggot, wireworms, grubs, and those those insects, then the higher rate insecticide treatment that we would offer would protect from those insects plus additional insects like corn rootworm. So that, that's been available and ongoing for several years. From our standpoint, if a customer makes a decision that they do not want to use insecticide, so they want to buy untreated seed, that's a decision that they need to make early winter, more like late fall. I need to order that seed before the 1st of December. So if that customer wants untreated seed, I need to get that order in early, and not every seed option is available to come untreated. As you can imagine, we sell Pioneer Seed. That's the largest seed corn company, or the largest seed planted in the United States. And so as they're harvesting seed and treating seed and packaging seed in the fall, through that processing, they need to know as early as possible, what needs to be, or what seeds I would need to not be treated, so that would be such a small portion of what they sell. They need to know that early. So from a customer standpoint, we need to let Pioneer know as early as possible what seed we don't want to have treated. From a practical standpoint, when I look back over the history of what we did before Neonics, if a guy, meaning a farmer, had a situation where they had insect problems on their farm, the way that would be handled would be we'd go out with a spray truck and we would spray an insecticide over the field. And in that scenario, we would spray 100% of the field, every acre, and basically every square inch of that acre would get covered with insecticide. As technology moved a little bit forward, a farmer had an opportunity to go to the state, get a chemical license so they could do this on their own, and their corn planter would be equipped with an insecticide box. So at that point, they would buy insecticide in 50-pound bags, put it in their planter, and then the planter would ban the insecticide in a 7-inch strip over the top of where the seed was planted. So we went from treating 100% of the acre, then it got down to about 30% of the acre when we were banning insecticide. And then as neonics came into the market, we went from 100% to 30% to now, when we're treating just the seed, we're treating basically less than 1% of the acre with insecticide now to control seeds. And we're basically pinpointing that insecticide just around the seed. The other thing that was accomplished when we sprayed the insecticide or banded it over the seed, that was applied on top of the ground. And so we were relying on Mother Nature to give us a little bit of rain to wash that insecticide down into the ground to help treat those insects that were below ground. Now we've got the seed that's 2 inches below ground. So we're putting the insecticide right next to the seed, or right on the seed, right where the insect problem would be. The insect that's away from the seed or away from the root, that's the one's not our problem. The ones that are our problem are the ones that are attacking or eating on our seed. So we've been able to pinpoint location of placement of insecticide, and we're basically able to control that insecticide from leaving the point where we want to treat. When the times when we used to apply it on top of the ground, or spray the whole acre, or band it over the seed, if we got a heavy rain, we couldn't control exactly where that insecticide could go. It could move off target with a heavy rain. So we've been able to pinpoint location to that. So that's kind of from an industry standpoint. From a farmer perspective, times when I was growing up, doing this with my dad, we handled that insecticide. We put that in our planter. That certainly we had to have specialized equipment to do that. Not every planter came equipped to handle insecticide in bags, one. And then two, certainly created additional worker labor to put that in there. And we still weren't getting the same effect that we get today by having our seeds treated. Last year, being 2021, our dairy participates in the Caring Dairy program through Ben & Jerry's. I'm assuming you guys are familiar with that program. And in one of the part of the program that we're in, we have to do a project every year, like advancing technologies or testing out technologies. So we did in 2021, and we'll replicate that study in 22, some treated seed with neonics versus untreated seed. So we took an 8-acre field, we planted the headlands out, and then all of the middle of the field, which worked out to about 5 acres. We did a 2.5-acre section with neonics, a 2.5-acre section without neonics, and the rest of the field was all treated the same. It all got the same fertility. It was the same variety of seed, just treated versus untreated. Got the same chemical spray, got all the same, I think I said fertilizer, manure applications were all equal. In the fall, when we harvested it, we harvested the 2.5 acres with the treated seed, the 2.5 acres with the untreated seed, and then did a yield comparison. And yield comparisons, we were about 10% short on yield on year one of the untreated seed. So if we average that field at a 20 tons per acre yield, the 10% would have been equal to 2 tons per acre. Silage last fall was worth $50 a ton. So we had to replace $100 per acre worth of corn silage because of the lost yield. So for the sake of arithmetic, 1 bag of seed corn will plant 2.5 acres worth of corn. So it cost us about $250 per bag of corn of silage that we had to go back and buy because we didn't grow enough per acre, if that makes sense. So that, that really making a change on our farm certainly would have put us at a huge economic disadvantage if we had replicated that study over 1,000 acres. Or if I look at it on a bigger scale, all the farms in Franklin County or all the corn acres in the state of Vermont would put our farms in the state at an economic disadvantage if they lost the right to use this technology. Not only at an economic
question, Cubby, we have a question from one of the members on the corn issue.
Just as you're completing the economic picture for us, is there a difference in cost between treated and untreated seeds?
So not anymore. 10 years ago, there used to be, it used to be $17 a bag cheaper to buy untreated seed. Today, if I sell you a bag of low rate insecticide treatment versus none, same price. And you ask yourself, or might ask the question, why would it be the same price? They're not applying the insecticide. It's because it really creates a hardship to be able to go and take a fraction of 1% of the seed to make it untreated versus, it changes the whole process. We're treating all this seed. Now we've got to shut down treating and go to specialize for, 100 bags or 200 or 300 bags out of a 10,000 bag run. So basically there's a equal charge as what it would be to the insecticide. So from a retailing standpoint, it's the same price, whether it's no insecticide or the low rate insecticide. So there was no cost savings to the farm for buying.
Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. So if I move forward after, moving forward on that study, what we had done, the other thing that we also did this spring on that field that we do not normally do is we scouted on a much more regular basis. We normally go through, we fit our ground, we plan our ground at 10 days, a week to 10 days out, we're starting to scout the ground, looking for more emergence to come up on corn. And we're not necessarily checking our field for insects at that point. We're looking, what we want when we plant is equal emergence, meaning all of our corn coming up in the same day. Because we had this, 2.5 acre chunk, we weren't just checking emergence, we were digging plants and checking scouting much more closely to identify if we had insect pressure. At that time, when we were doing that, we were not seeing that we had insect pressure. So the question, that we were asking ourselves early on is, are we, this will be interesting how this study comes out. We're not seeing insect pressure. We're seeing kind of equal emergence. Corn seems to be treated versus untreated coming up equally, but the insect pressure was equal enough to have cost us yield, but it wasn't even a visual. What we couldn't even visually really see the insect problem that we had there. It was so minute. Year one cost us 10% yield. I can only speculate year 2, year 3 going forward, what we're going to see on these acres as we move forward. But with that said, if we were scouting our 1,000 acres, or if this was not an option for any farms to use in the state, I'm not sure where we would come up with the crop scouters or the agronomists to go out and start checking all these acres to determine if we did in fact have an insect problem. Once the corn's up and it's 3 inches tall and 10% or 20% or 30% of your plants are missing, it's really too late to go back then and address that issue. When a corn plant, from an agronomy standpoint, if I get a plant that gets to be 2 inches tall and the next plant comes up next to it, or is just starting to emerge, that new seedling that's 2 or 3 days behind really turns into a weed. It's never going to be as productive as a corn plant as the 2 on both sides of it. So uniform emergence is really what we have to have. Meaning, if we have to go back and replant corn in a field because our plants were lost due to insect pressure, we're going to have a very dramatic impact against yield. We will have forage, but it'll be low quality, low starch, and it'll be, filler, but with very low nutritional value, if that makes sense.
Okay, anything else, Cubby, on that, or you ready?
I'm ready for questions. I think off the top of my head, that's what I had prepared.
Yeah. Questions from committee members? If you did do a whole field and lost that percentage because you were using untreated seeds, did you figure out the cost of how many extra acres you were going to have to plant, how many extra trips around the field that was going to make with the equipment, and really the total cost?
Well, so for the example that I gave on year 1, we had a 10% yield loss. So if we're growing 1,000 acres on that farm, we would have needed to add an additional 100 acres. I can only speculate that on year 2, our yield loss will be greater because we haven't kept any of the insects that are in our soil in check. We've kind of let them grow. They've gone through a breeding cycle. In year 2, there will be more insects that will continue to breed and the population will rise. But yeah, I would say, coming out of year 1, with a 10% reduction, we would need to go buy 10% of our feed to move forward. And so that in itself will create another challenge. I'm not sure if the committee is aware, but last fall when corn was harvested in Vermont, the corn price was roughly $3.75 to $4 a bushel for grain corn. Today, grain corn is trading at $7.25 to $7.50 a bushel. So what that basically does from the price of silage is took it from $50 a ton to $80 a ton as harvested for replacement cost or value of feed. In the same time, what would happen is if we reduced our yield by 10%, and let's assume that was what was going on across the state, there wouldn't be enough feed for us to feed all of our cows. So what we'd be forced to do is to import feed from out of state, like beet pulp or citrus pulp or soy oils. We'd have to come up with some sort of forage replacer to do that. In the state of Vermont, as you guys are aware, we have lost, we've gone from 140,000 cows to 120,000 cows. So what that's done is basically freed up forage for farms to be able to supply to their, a guy that we used to sell silage to, or the guy that used to buy silage has been able to, as his neighbor sold his cows, rent his land and grow more of his own corn. While that happened, it also freed up acres in the state to produce more shell corn or more of our own corn in the state of Vermont. And that has basically allowed us to stop importing corn from the West or corn from the North. And that's kind of really happened a lot in the last 10 years. From our ag business side, we used to have in Sheldon 400 or 500 ton of dry shell corn storage. And that we would fill in the fall with local corn in the late 2000s. Today, we have 9,000 ton of shell corn storage. So we went from 400 ton to 9,000 ton in 20 years of actual storage at our feed mill in Sheldon of corn that we buy locally every fall. 20 years ago, that corn wasn't raised here because we had more dairy cows and it was all gone to silage. Today, so that corn was all imported, either came from Canada or came in rail from the West. And that was used to feed our dairy cows that were imported corn into our state. Today, that corn is all grown locally from farms in Franklin County that we buy back from them and then, run through our feed mill. If we did away with this neonic situation and we lost that 10% yield, those acres would go from grain corn back into silage to fill that void.
Yeah, any other questions for Cubby?
Cubby, it's Corey. What percentage of your sales of seeds, roughly do you, how much of an impact would this be for our farmers in Vermont? How much of this are we selling treated versus untreated?
We're 99+% untreated. As of today, I don't have one bag of untreated seed sold in the state of Vermont for many of my customers. So that's meaning Franklin, Grand Isle, Lamoille, Orleans County, Chittenden County. If I ask the question to our store out of Middlebury, I don't believe they have any sold either. So we're selling none or virtually none. And so if somebody came today and said, I want to buy untreated seed, I would go put a request and ask. Maybe I could get it, maybe I couldn't. But I have nothing in my supply today that's untreated. So it would make a dramatic impact for our farmers.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, well, thank you very much, Cubby, for being with us. Certainly appreciate all the experience and from both selling and growing that you've had in your testimony.
All right, very good. Thank you.
You're welcome to stay on if you can and listen. We'll move to John now from Seaway.
You're muted, John.
We can't hear you.
He's not muted.
No. Oh,
No?
no, still not right.
I wonder if his computer mic is off.
Is your mic off, John?
Why don't you ask him to go leave and come back?
John, do you have a
Why
phone?
not?
Jump on a phone?
Yeah. Do you have a phone there, John, that you can talk from? Yeah, just dial in. You got the number. Do you have the phone number?
He can use Zoom on his phone as well. So he should be able to,
Oh,
has,
okay.
should be loaded on all his devices, so.
Yeah.
No.
When we go to another person?
Yeah. Claire, hey, John, while you're trying to get that going, we'll switch to a different witness. Claire, are you on? There you go. Morning, Claire.
Good morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity to testify on this important matter today. I'll keep my introduction brief, as I know I've talked to you guys already this year. My name is Clara Eyre. I'm part of the third generation of Fairmont Farm. We have an LFO in East Montpelier and an MFO in Craftsbury. We take great pride in our mission statement and really use it as a driving force for many decisions on our farm. Our mission is to strive to be a profitable dairy farm with the utmost consideration for the safety and happiness of our people, the cleanliness of our environment, and the health of our animals. We further sum it up with our tagline, farming for future generations. I wanted to share this with you today because I think it's really important to understand the why. We have 7 fourth generation kids growing up on the farm today, and we really want there to be future opportunities for them to come back to. We also own about 2,000 acres of conserved land with the Vermont Land Trust. And I mention this because I believe it comes with great responsibility to continue to be stewards of the land forever into the future. We crop 3,500 acres to feed our herd. And of that, about 1,500 acres is corn ground. I want to share a little bit about our practices and the benefit we see in treated seeds. Firstly, this conversation is very relevant in today's markets, and Cubby spoke to some of this earlier, but corn prices are nearly double what we've experienced as normal in the last 10 years, and they haven't hit this price since 2013. I recently got back from National Council of Farmers Cooperatives annual meeting where we heard speakers talk about the world markets. The corn shortage is a huge concern right now. China's growing their swine herd and have completely moved away from scrap foods to a corn-based diet to protect against diseases. Well, they are increasing their corn acres, their corn imports are also increasing, which is putting pressure worldwide. We're also continuing to compete with biofuels for corn acres in the United States, as many industries are working to achieve net zero status by their deadlines. Add to that the drought and water issues many states are dealing with and the current issues going on in Ukraine, and it's really unclear when corn prices are going to come back down. In the Northeast, farmers have a huge advantage of being able to grow much of their own feed. Our farm typically grows about 60% of our our cow's diet. In good years, we're able to do some high moisture corn or snaplage that can replace cornmeal as well. We feel really lucky to have had an excellent crop last year, and we put up enough snaplage to get us through the first 3 quarters of this year. The stability and improved margin that this creates for us as farmers in Vermont is immeasurable. What makes an excellent corn crop and how do treated seeds come into play here? Treated seeds allow our corn to get a good early start and protect against early pests and diseases, thus increasing our yield potential and decreasing the need for replants. Replanting is really costly. It means additional trips over the field, which can also create soil compaction and lead to reduced water retention and increased risk in runoff events, as well as lowering the yield potential and significantly shorter day varieties, which also lead to decreased yields. Seed treatment benefits the crop as being an integrated pest management system rather than a rescue treatment that do not work for all pests. One of the most amazing things about the seed treatment is it allows us to effectively treat our crop while only applying pesticides to 1% of the field, as opposed to in-furrow treatments, which is about 30%, or broadcast, which is 100% of the field. The other benefit to seed treatments is knowing it's on the seed, which is planted into the ground about 2 inches. So it's not sitting on top of the oil like other alternatives. On top of the soil like other alternatives. On a financial note, Allowing the treatment to be on the seed keeps our early season pesticide costs around $15 an acre. If we were to switch to an alternative, it would vary, but it would be about $37.50 an acre. For a farm our size, that would be an increase of just under $34,000 annually. We feel really good about the evaluations and research that's gone into the treated seed technology and believe it's the safest way for us to protect our crops and in turn our yields. In a world where we're constantly searching for how we can do more with less, I believe treated seeds do just that. And I also want to add, I'm really excited for the opportunity to serve on the Agriculture Innovation Board. This is a diverse group representing all relevant sectors on this issue. And we've just started our meetings. We had our first introduction meeting last month with another meeting scheduled this coming month. And I just hope that we're given the chance to do the job we're asked to do and work on these issues. Thanks for your time, and I'm happy to take any questions. That's what I've had prepared for today.
Questions from committee members? Claire, when you put your treated seed in the planter, do they get just poured in a hopper in the planter? So is there a lot of residue that like flies off the seed and in the air as you fill the planter with a new bag of treated seed?
No, I don't believe so. Others may be better to ask that question to, as I'm not the one in the planter, but I have been there when it's being filled, and that's not something I've witnessed.
So, because we did hear that was a concern, that when they dumped from the bag into the planter, a lot of dust went into the air and then, bees or whatever could come and drive through that or fly through that dust and be killed. And,
I guess, again, I don't know that I have the expertise on this issue, but being there, having, seen the process, I would have a really hard time believing that it lingers long enough to have any sort of effect. It doesn't seem, there's not a big cloud, I don't see that, no.
Yeah. Well, any other questions for Claire? Well, thank you very much for your time, Claire. Appreciate it.
Yep, you're welcome.
So, John, did you get rigged up?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, golly, I guess.
Very good.
Good morning and welcome.
Thank you for the opportunity today. The two previous speakers did an excellent job of summarizing the situation. If I could give a little perspective from the seed industry side, I'm a manager with the Seedway Company. We're a regional company, primarily here in the northeast part of the United States. We're part of the farmer-owned cooperative system. We do have an office and a warehouse location in Shoreham, Vermont, where we have 8 employees. To speak real quickly to the question that was just asked about the dust, there's very little dust, and the industry's done a lot of work to minimize dusting off with the seed treatments. Years ago, there'd be much more risk when the planter treatment was added that Mr. Bordeaux alluded to, when you were adding a powder on top of the seed and then mixing it in, or even worse, using the organophosphate, those highly toxic products that go in a band or in a furrow behind the seed. I can speak from personal experience to the toxicity of some of those. I'm a little older than Mr. Bordeaux was, and I was about 25. I was filling a planter with the Loris band, which is a or Purifrost product, not taking the necessary precautions, the dust comes up. I got to the back end of a 30-acre field and got violently ill. And those products are not user-friendly and they're not environmentally friendly. So we've come a long way from that situation where we're using really toxic chemicals that are not safe for the environment or the people handling them. So just for full disclosure, I also farm as Mr. Bordeaux does, and we've been primarily no-till for 25 years. I'm a firm believer in minimum or no-till systems whereby we reduce the amount of fuel used to produce the crop, just from a work standpoint, much better for the soil in terms of soil erosion, both from wind and water, and just overall soil health. One of the challenges with no-till and with cover cropping is it creates a situation in the soil where the soil is healthier and healthier for everything living in the soil, including wireworms, seed corn maggots, and so forth. So the question was asked, I believe, of Mr. Bordeaux about production and cost of untreated versus treated. In our company, it's similar to Pioneer in that 99.9% of our brand is treated with some level of a neonic insecticide. We do offer organic seed corn as well, which would be untreated. It's a very small percentage of the total. From a production perspective, just to put it in perspective, the United States is going to plant roughly 92 million acres of corn this year. Out of that, about 10 to 11 million is for silage. Here in New York and in Vermont, the percentage of that is silage is much higher. It's 50+% silage. But from a availability of hybrids, most of the emphasis in development and genetics is on corn hybrids for grain first, and typically longer seasons. So the options available from a genetics perspective are more limited, and the acreage that is a shorter season and suited for silage is relatively small of the overall picture. And if you now start trying to further dilute that small pool by having differentiated treatment options, it becomes quite difficult. So as Mr. Bordeaux said, the likelihood that they would have to limit the number of options that would offered, our company would probably do as well. We would have to pick a handful of varieties that would be produced and processed as untreated seed. Is there any seed company specific questions that I could potentially answer for anyone?
Yeah, Chris?
Yeah, are you processing the seeds and giving the treatment there in your facility, or do you buy them wholesale as treated seeds?
Okay, in the case of corn, we for many years produced it in Hall, New York. About 7 years ago, and even at that time, we produced about 15% of the total. And about 7 years ago, we decided to contract it all with producers located in Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ontario. And so we work with primarily 5 family-owned seed production companies to produce the seeds for us. And they grow it, they condition it, they treat it, and they bag it, and then we bring it in. In the case of soybeans, small grains, and so forth, those we produce both in New York and in Pennsylvania.
The soybeans, they're treated as well, right?
They may be, yes. So on the case of soybeans, probably 60% of the soybeans are treated with a neonic, and the other 40% would be untreated or just pre-inoculated.
Yeah. And Brian?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think Mr. Bordeaux gave us a pretty good idea of the sort of history of the treated material. But I'm assuming, as is true with everything else in our world, that there are constant innovations and that sort of thing taking place. Maybe the adhesive material has changed over the years, you know, the glue that's going to hold these together. Can you just talk a little bit about sort of the process of the continuing innovations that are taking place?
So yeah, that's a constant evolution, and we look forward to new technologies all the time. In fact, some of the newer innovations, not necessarily related to seed corn maggot or wireworm, are more biologicals that are added as either planter box treatments or to the seed. Many of these are able to allow the plant to react to stresses. Some of these allow the plant to make more efficient use of nutrient uptake, particularly phosphorus, which is important, certainly in areas with watershed issues. I'm not aware of anything imminent being released that would be a suitable replacement for the neonics currently.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Anything else from you, John?
I just wanted to follow up on one other little issue. And both the previous speakers talked about the importance of a uniform stand where every seed comes up uniformly. And my neighbor just retired at age 90 a year ago, and he had 70 years of experience. And one of his favorite sayings was, the best way to control weeds in a field is to have a good stand, which means a corn plant every 7 inches. And if you have a 10, 20, 30% reduction in a stand, you're going to have weeds, which is going to then require some additional method of weed control, whether it be cultivation, mechanical, or additional spray to control the weeds. So it's one of those things that you don't even think about all the ripple effects sometimes of what a poor stand costs you. And in most of New York and Vermont, our growing season is so short that if you have a stand loss of 50 or 60%, and I've, as a farmer, I've seen it, it's you feel like you've been punched in the gut when you go out there and you see one plant instead of every 7 inches, one plant every 7 feet. The opportunity to go back and replant that and get a crop at all, or one of even reduced yield, is limited. Our options are very limited just due to the shortness of our growing season.
Well, I would think uniform growth would be very important. And that there's many different things. You could have that cause that. You could have a planter that's not planting right, but you could have bad soils where the seed won't take. So there's different things that cause that. What about with you said you're all no-till. Do you get pretty, your field's pretty uniform with no-till? Yeah, that's where I've seen fields that are not uniform sometimes, is in a no-till field.
It could be more of a challenge for certain. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Any anything else? No. So,
If if I may, I just like to kind of sum up that, when I was on the local school board, I like to try to frame things as to be, what is our objective? And I think in agriculture, our objective is number one, to produce safe, abundant, affordable food in a sustainable manner. And, some of the things that are to help us do that are cover crops, no-till, minimum till, nutrient utilization. And some of the tools that we really need to do that are these seed treatments, as well as things like glyphosate, honestly, which allow for some of these better practices to take place.
any other questions from the committee members? Well, thank you, John, and you're welcome to stay on if you have the time to listen, and if you have more things you want to bring up, just raise your hand and we'll call on you once we get through the group.
Thank you, sir. I've got just a few minutes. I will stay on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Margaret, did you have anyone else that you'd invited to be on?
Yes, you have Katie Savinelli is ready to go. She should be on your screen.
Don't see her.
Yeah, good morning.
Okay, can you see me? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Good. I have a presentation if that's okay. Can I share a presentation?
Yes, I just made a co-host. You're co-host now, so you can share it.
Okay, thank you. And let me just give a quick introduction to myself. My name is Katie Savinelli. I am actually, I went to school and studied insects. So I have a PhD in entomology. So I didn't see my name as doctor, but I'm actually a doctor. I don't tell many people about that. But I went to school to study insects because I'm quite fascinated by insects as well as farming. And currently I work for Syngenta, which is a large chemical and also a seed company, but I'm on the crop protection side, so more of the chemical side. And I'm also head of our stewardship department. And our stewardship department, really, we want to ensure that our products are used properly. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'll probably reiterate some of the points that were already made this morning, but I think it's always good to hear more than once. So I'm going to be talking about neonicotinoid seed coatings and pollinators. And I'll talk a little bit about pollinators at first, and then I want to talk about some of the questions that were raised relative to the technology, because I can explain that, as well as the dust. So certainly, as you've heard, there's a lot of benefits for seed treatments. This is why farmers are using them. I think most farmers, if they don't see benefits, they don't want to use them. And by the way, my grandfather was an orange farmer in Florida. When I heard Mr. Bordeaux speak about citrus pulp, I said, I remember when I was a kid seeing all that citrus pulp, and it was for cow feed. So I brought back some memories. But anyways, as mentioned, seed treatments really protect the seed and the seedling. And this is really the most important part of the crop's growth, because it's got to get out of the ground. It's got to start growing. It's got to get roots, et cetera. We heard about, plant survival, healthier plants, increase in yield. We've heard about that this morning. And then also it was mentioned more than once that it minimizes the foliar applications. And certainly, and I'll point this out in a second, but when you think about foliar applications, these are applications made to the leaves of the plant versus something that's very precise in the seed. It's a much more advanced technology. And I'm also going to address a little bit of the concerns relative to honeybees. Honeybees is the insect that we look at when we're doing testing for registration. And I don't have a lot of slides on dust, but let me just talk a little bit about dust for a minute. In terms of the dust that people talk about, sometimes when you see the planters going through the field, you see the dust that's coming from the soil. That's not the seed treatment. That's really just soil dust. Where we have concerns around dust is the vacuum planters. I am not as familiar with Vermont. I live in North Carolina, by the way. with how many vacuum planters there are versus a finger pickup. But certainly with the vacuum planters, there's concern because there is dust coming out of that, but there's been modifications made to the equipment. So it's pushing it down to the ground rather than going up in the air. So like I said, I'm not an expert on I know enough about equipment to be dangerous, but I'm not an equipment manufacturer. We'll not be talking about that today. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to really talk about is really the science that goes behind it. And there's a lot of science. And, as I mentioned, I'm a scientist. I also have a colleague, Max Fakin, who's a really good scientist too. And he does a lot of the studies that I'll be mentioning. And if there's questions that I can't address later on, we'll let Max Fakin address them as well. So I want to talk a little bit about bee stressors, start off. I want to talk about the EPA risk assessment. So EPA does register these products. So these products all have to go through registration review. And we're actually going through re-registration right now. And I'll also want to talk about the science of seed coatings. And I think this will help put in perspective some of the questions that were asked earlier. So bees, honeybees in particular, and we know a lot about honeybees because they're very well studied. They have a lot of different potential issues, parasites, diseases, nutrition. It almost sounds like humans, parasites, diseases, nutrition, weather patterns and changing climate. I don't know where we're ending up with the weather pattern. I know when I've talked to Margaret, you're getting more rain in Vermont than you used to, like, sudden rain. Pesticides, and keep in mind, a lot of people are worried about the pesticides that are used in the field. But beekeepers are also using pesticides to keep out the parasites and the other insects that are getting into the hive. So not many people talk about that, but there is pesticide use, and they use like pyrethroids because they have activity against some of the problems that they have in the hive. Beekeeping management practices can vary a lot. Genetic characteristics as well as queens. And queens are really important because queens are like the founders of the whole colony, and certain characteristics of the queen. I was talking to Margaret the other day, some queens and some of their worker bees are better at cleaning themselves off and cleaning, off the varroa mites too. So there are certain genetics that a lot of the people that are working in this area are looking towards to making bees a little bit more, cleanly and getting rid of the varroa mites. But keep in mind, varroa mite, it's an introduced pest. It was not always in the United States. And so 20 years ago, maybe it was even longer than that, probably when I first started working, we did not have varroa mites. It was also typical more in Asian honeybees, but now it's adapted to the European honeybee, which is what we have in the US. So it's like farming, there's constant challenges, and a lot of our challenges come from introduced or invasive species. Now, if you're not from, Syngenta and Max Fakin was actually one of the co-authors on this, but there's a really good publication out of Purdue. It's called The Complex Life of the Honeybee. If you have any interest in any of, how this whole process works, this was written for people that are not scientists. So it's really well written for, lots of pictures, lots of, just basic explanations about how bees can potentially exposed to pesticides, what EPA does for the risk assessment process. I'm not going to get it a lot today, but it's a pretty complex process. It's not simple, and it's actually gotten more advanced over the last 10 years. Talks about exposure, tiered approach. Tiered approach is just, and I'll show you an example of a tiered approach in a minute. Risk quotients, registration decisions, and even labels. So I think Margaret, like before, will share this presentation, but certainly that's a really good, it's really good to have. And if you really want to have some basic understanding about the whole registration process, this is really well written for just non-scientists. One slide I wanted to show is that certainly one thing as a company that's involved in science and everything, science is constantly evolving. We're learning new things. It's almost like, well, I don't want to bring up the COVID, but it's almost like as we learn more things, we start doing things a little bit differently. And way back when we were doing some of the tests, we just did tests on the adult bees. And so we knew what the contact activity, which is, will it die right away versus chronic. Now we do a lot more studies in the laboratory looking at both adults and the immatures. And we've also done more studies looking at, what happens to the pollen and nectar. And the pollen and nectar have been really important studies to do because it allows us to say, okay, if we use a seed treatment, what will happen in the pollen and nectar? And I'll tell you the answer in a minute. But that's been a really important studies that we've done, and they've been pretty extensive studies. We do them across the whole United States. We do them on a lot of different crops, and they've been great studies because it gives us a level that we know whether or not we should be concerned and whether or not we need to do some things. Additionally, we do some studies that are intense, that type of thing. We've done some feeding studies to different bee colonies, and so we know a precise amount that's been fed. So we've done a lot of studies. Neonics were kind of the trigger for all these studies, but as we go through the re-registration process, we will continue to do this type of work, with fungicides, herbicides, et cetera. So it's not just insecticides. We want to make sure we know if there is any risk, and if there is a risk, what we need to do. Oh, okay. I'm not going to let anybody in. Anyway, so let's just talk a little bit about the re-registration. So we're not quite done with the re-registration because we're also doing endangered species kind of in between. But the pollinator risk assessment for thimethoxam, and thimethoxam is a Syngenta product, so I'll mainly focus on that. That was completed in January of 2020. And here's the good news. The good news from a seed treatment point of view, and this is pollen and nectar, was that it was low risk for seed treatments. Low risk is as good as it gets with EPA. There's no such thing as no risk in EPA's mind. It's low risk. And so that's very, very important. The other thing that's very important is that, so that gives us a really good sense that, when we're planting seeds and worried about pollen and nectar, that is not a concern for seed treatments. You can see the different crops that we've done studies. We actually have data on a number of crops. Corn does not have nectar, so we didn't do any corn. Excuse me. But at the same time, we did seed treatments. We also did foliar and soil applications. And so when EPA reviewed all of the data, they said the focus when you're talking about risk mitigation, and risk mitigation is do not apply during flowering, understand where the bees are, that type of thing. The risk mitigation has been primarily focused on foliar uses and soil uses. But seed treatments, I'm going to say it again, low risk, as good as it gets with EPA. And that's a really, go ahead.
What does that mean, low risk? Where does it break from high risk or medium risk?
Okay, so I'm going to get a little technical. So as I mentioned, we had done feeding studies. And when we did feeding studies, we said, there's a certain level, which is what we call the level of concern. And sorry, my phone keeps buzzing. Okay. I'm gonna actually put it in the drawer. So we do feeding studies, and it tells us what the level of concern is. And below that level of concern, if the bees are exposed to that level, it's a low risk. And Max, I don't know if you want to add anything else. I don't think we have medium and high risk, but it's just either it's at the level of concern, which is below the level of concern, or above the level of concern.
Yeah, I mean, that's correct, Katie. I mean, it's really the key studies that we had were colony feeding studies, so honeybee colony feeding studies. And so we know what the effect level is, and for seed treatments, the concentrations in pollen and nectar are below those levels.
Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome. Any other questions? But I'm going to try to push on because last time we gave this, we had so many questions. Okay, so. Okay. Now I'm going to talk about seed treatments. And you can see the jars on the bottom of the screen. There's lots of different colors. We purposely put in a dye to allow people to know that, number one, they shouldn't be eating them. And so in other words, they have been treated. And so Syngenta has what we call the Seed Care Institute. And as you can see on the map, these are all of our seed care institutes globally and also in the United States. And so we have lots of different groups working all over the world, ensuring that our seed treatment and seed care is at the highest level of technology. And just to kind of get into a little bit of this is that, it's going beyond just the seed protection. So we have what we call a recipe. And the recipe is really interesting because, everyone thinks that you just take the product and you put it on top of the seed, it won't stick. So we have a recipe. So it's the product and all of the different pieces. And I'm going to show it to you in the next slide, but there's the recipe is really what is sort of the whole entire thing, including the actual active ingredient that goes on the seed. We look very carefully at how to apply it, what the quality is. We do a lot of, earlier there was a question about, when you're to Clara about the dust. We do a lot of studies making sure that the dust is not coming off of the seed. And we use European standards because US doesn't really have good standards. So we use European standards to make sure that the dust does not come off the seed. Stewardship, I'm not going to get a lot to it. In fact, I hit a couple slides. We go into a lot of stewardship, how best to use the product. We train our customers. So our customers that are, buying seeds or treating seeds, because we don't treat all the seeds, as mentioned, other organizations treat them. We train them on how to treat the seeds. We also are looking at seed safety and biology, because remember, the seed is a living organism. And when you cover it up with all these things, it still needs to germinate, because if it doesn't germinate, the farmers will be really mad at us. And so it's really important to look at the seed safety. And we look at seed safety over a couple of years. It's not just 1 year. And then we also do a lot of marketing support. And we will also run tests to make sure that when the seeds are treated, they're treated with the correct rate, because the rate is such a small amount. So there's a lot of work that goes into it. And so I visited our site in Stanton, Minnesota, and it's quite amazing. And if you ever want to go there, we can arrange to have tours and you can go through the whole process. And we test these seeds and equipment, we test them in the lab, we do a lot of testing. It's pretty impressive. And even when we're developing the recipe, it's not like it's like, it's like making a cake. If you don't put all the ingredients in the right amounts, guess what? The cake won't rise or something. It's the same thing. You have to really have the recipe refined. And so there's a lot of work that goes into it.
Right, you're on right.
Okay. And as I was sort of alluding to this before, but just in terms of the recipe, I'm going to just kind of go through this. So there's both the film coating and the polymer. And the question was asked, we're constantly looking, are there new polymers or there's better ways of doing it? So the film coating and polymer are really important. We also optimize it for dust off, as I mentioned, as well as abrasion and flow, because if it's going through the machine and it gets stuck, not a good thing either. We look at recipes for local needs, because in some cases, they're planting seeds in the more northern climates where it's a little colder. We're in the South, it's a little warmer, that type of thing. They do the calculations and everything. And then also, I think the other key point is more and more there's being inoculants, such as soybeans, and micronutrients that are actually added in the recipe. So we have to make sure that all of these things are compatible together. So this is it's a long drawn out process, but it's a lot of technology and it's constantly improving, which I think is great. Okay, any questions on seed treatment before I move on to the next in my final section?
Anything? No, I guess we're all set.
Good, thank you. And I'm from the north, so that's why I talk fast. Sorry. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about pest management. I'll be reiterating a few things that you heard this morning about some of the pests. I want to talk about integrated pest management. I want to re-emphasize the fact that seed treatments are part of integrated pest management, in spite of what a lot of people say. I want to just remind everybody, I have some nice pictures of some early season insect pests in corn. And then I want to talk a little bit about how Canada views things, as well as the European experience. And this is like a real life experience. And I call it farming without neonicotinoid seed coatings. And so I think in my mind, sometimes, and I think Mr. Bordeaux was talking earlier about, setting up those trials where it's 2.5 acres and 2.5 acres. Those are real life tests. Those are how you really tell whether or not things are working. And this is really my area of expertise, because I spent many, many years in the field. So I actually like talking about insects and field work. Okay, so as I think we've heard this morning, but I want to just reemphasize it. This is really an economical level of risk management. Now, Are they scouting in the fall when they make the decision to buy the seeds? It's not possible. And it's also protection from the early season pests. Scouting, it's really hard to scout for these pests. I know that Mr. Bordeaux said they had gone out and done it, but I mean, they're all over the place. There's not really good, well-defined scouting methods. I've looked through the literature. I've looked through, lots of things. It's not really well-defined. There's not really well-defined economic threshold levels. So you're using this as a way to say, okay, there's a good chance I'll have this pest. And so therefore I want to be able to protect myself because the alternatives are not as good. And so it reduces the need for rescue treatments if rescue treatments are available, or replanting. And certainly in Vermont, as was mentioned, you're planting later in the season anyway. 2 weeks or 3 weeks in a season, that's a huge difference in yield. So if you have to replant, you either don't do it and you lose that year, or you replant and your yield is definitely restricted because of less days of growing season. And it was mentioned more than once, but stronger, more uniform stands and healthier plants. It's kind of like infants, you want to get them up and growing and stronger, and it's better to take care of them when they're younger than later on. And as I mentioned earlier, and I'll mention it again, it minimizes the need for foliar insecticide applications. And our European colleagues found that out within maybe 2 years. Okay, so as I said, I'm an entomologist. We haven't seen any insect pictures today, so I wanted to just share some of these lovely pictures with you. Most of the problems that are being caused is actually the immature phases. So seed corn maggot, very small, but it looks like a housefly, but and I'll tell you in a minute what it likes. But seed corn maggot gets on the seeds and the roots. Wireworms are interesting because they're, the adults are not so problematic, but these are certainly a big problem. And white grubs. And if you're familiar with Japanese beetles, these are the immatures of the Japanese beetles, amongst other things. So these are your 3 culprits. I've heard these all 3 mentioned this morning. So it was good. And these are all in Vermont. Now, I want to just kind of go through this just to remind you of something. So certainly seed corn maggot gets onto a lot of different crops, wireworms and white grubs. And I think this is kind of important. They feed on corn and other grasses. And typically if you're planting in sod or if there's grasses around, they love living in places where there's grasses. But they also, wireworms feed on a lot of other crops too. So you can't say, oh, I'll rotate to a different crop, because more often than not, the wireworms are there as well. The weather climate in Vermont, cool, wet spring weather, great for seed corn maggot. High organic matter and decomposing plant material, it's good for seed corn maggot. So all the things around no-till and cover crops, this is ideal for seed corn maggot. And in terms of the wireworms, their life cycle is about 2 to 6 years in the ground. So it's not as if you control them 1 year and you won't have any more. They can last 2 to 6 years. As I mentioned, all of these insects really will feed on either the seeds, the seedlings, or the cotyledon. So it's really an early season pest, and it's in the ground. All of these insects are in the ground. And in terms of rescue treatments, seed corn maggots, it's really economical. And oh, by the way, I should mention this. I took this, I was looking for something from Vermont. I didn't see as much, but I took this from New York. So this is, same climatic zone. And so they say replanting is really economical. And same thing with both wireworms and white grubs. Replanting, big decision, probably not the decision you want to make, and there's really no rescue treatment. So, once you have this damage, you can't go in and say, I'll treat for them and then they'll go away, because they won't. And the control options really, as we've heard more than once today, is really about seed treatments at planting. It's the best way to go. Or you can go back to the way it used to be when they were using banded applications and they had the insecticide boxes and that type of thing. And I've been in this business since 1984, so I've been through all of it. I'm just going to briefly go through what Canada did. So Canada did an extensive report in 2016 relative to trying to understand pests and these early season pests in corn and soybeans, but some of the same thing, identifying the pest. What's the pest pressure? Economic thresholds, they don't exist. monitoring, monitoring is a costly activity. There's more and more concern around farm labor and getting, farm labor. And so it's really costly, and who's actually going to do the work? And then also, the monitoring timing is usually in the springtime, but the seed purchases last fall or in the fall. So there's, the time's about 6 months difference. And then if you want to do risk management, you avoid conditions such as cool, wet weather. But, more often than not, that's probably, where farmers in Vermont plant their corn. So if you can't avoid that, what are you going to do? You have to go to the next best thing. Okay, let me just touch a little bit about Europe. And so Europe decided in, I think it was back in 2013, there was first discussion around, they didn't ban it right out, but they were saying we're going to restrict the neonic uses. And then in 2015, I think they banned it. And I was actually surprised as an entomologist how quickly the insects became a problem, because, sometimes it takes a while to build up. But there was a study that was done in 2017. These are 5 impact studies, and the listing of how to look it up the study. But you can see they lost a lot, and this is really oilseed rape or canola. So they lost a lot in terms of yield. They had to use additional land in order to get the same yields. So that's always a problem, because land is always, one of these limited resources. And as I think Mr. Bordeaux mentioned earlier, he was, they started importing corn, potatoes, and oilseed rape. So in other words, from being an exporter, they became an importer, and that's expensive. And then, it's market fluctuations, as we all know. And you can see how on the bottom left-hand side, how the neonics, what it did in terms of yield. And also, this is euros, 3 to 4 billion euros per year. And they lost about 900 million euros per year. So that's a significant amount of money. And if you're a farmer and you're trying to grow these crops, what are you going to do? And a lot of them stopped growing because it just wasn't economical. Or they started making a lot of foliar applications, and they used up even the foliar applications for these early season pests like flea beetles that they couldn't use later in the season. So it's quite a problem. And just a couple of other things, just in terms of, bigger picture, negative impacts for biodiversity, water is used, the pest management, and this is the part that I really focus on, becomes more expensive, and time. So, and the flea beetles were the ones that really came in. And so the flea beetles, a lot of times it's even hard to get into the field, because in Europe, and I lived in England for about 5 years, so I know a little bit about Europe, it's wet. It's wet and damp, and to get even a tractor across the field under those conditions, not very useful. And those flea beetles will take out oilseed rape. They will cause enough damage that they'll have to replant. So just a lot of significant problems. So my last slide that I want to just reiterate what I've talked about is certainly honeybees face multiple challenges. There's no doubt. And we as a company are always trying to make sure that we understand what our products do, and we're mitigating any potential risk for honeybees. And as mentioned, we do a lot more studies than we did in the past. I think it's good that we're doing more studies. I also think it tells us really where we have potential problems, where we have low risk. I'll say it again, neonics and seed treatments and pollen and nectar is considered to be low risk, as good as it gets. The seed coating, as mentioned, we have this, lots and lots of technology goes in seed coating, constant improvement, constant making sure that there's no dust off from the seeds, constant improvement to make sure that it goes through the equipment, it can be stored cold, et cetera. So there's a lot of things that happen. Seed treatments are part of IPM, integrated pest management. And then also the early season soil insects, very difficult to scout for. It's a lot easier to use the seed treatment and get that control that's necessary versus replanting, which is a larger expense and may not be profitable. And then certainly from what we can learn from Europe was by banning the neonics, they have either gotten out of certain crops, or they're now importing crops where they hadn't before. So that's all I had. And I'm going to stop sharing and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. Are there questions from the committee?
Well, that was pretty informative.
I guess I have a question.
Okay.
Katie, you know, the European farmers and their community broadly is trying to build a healthy economy, so they would be aware of the data points you've just alerted us to. Given all of that, any idea if they're re-examining their ban? I mean, it seemed you paint a stark picture.
Let me just talk, let me make three different points. So first of all, Europe does assessments differently than we do in the United States. So they don't necessarily consider benefits, whereas EPA looks at both risk and benefits, which I think is key. Europe just looks at the hazard. So if they say if there's a hazard, then we don't want to mitigate it. So I think that's number one. In terms of the re-looking at it, they have what they call derogations. And I learned this word, I didn't know it a couple of years ago, okay? So derogations basically means, okay, it's not registered, but we'll make an exception. It's kind of like our Section 18s in the United States. And so we'll make an exception. So the United Kingdom went through a derogation. I think France did too. And so, but it's a kind of a tricky process because it's a legal process. It takes time. And you can imagine there's a lot of opinions on both sides that say, no, we don't like this. It's better. And the other thing that I think is always worth, and I'm going to actually make 4 points, sorry. The other point is, you know, when you look at honeybee populations, generally speaking, they're doing well in Europe. And a lot of it's, you know, related to what's going on in the US. And keep in mind, honeybees are kind of like cows. It's a domestic animal, and how they're maintained has a lot to do with how they're doing. So Europe is definitely different. And then one other thing I want to mention, and this just came out in the news, I think last week, and it's related to Ukraine, but, you know, Europe was trying to say, okay, we're going to get rid of 50% of pesticide use. We're going to stop, you know, we're going to grow more food on less acres and everything. It was that fork to farm, the fork to farm program. Well, last year they said, well, we've decided we're not going to do that right away because we really need to be able to produce our own food. And having lived in Europe, having, you know, heard a lot about what happened during, you know, they call it the war, but it's really World War II. They want to, you know, Europe always wants to be able to supply their own food, and not having these opportunities really scares them because they remember what it used to be.
Sure, but Europe is different. But when you tell them they're losing, it's a $4 billion decision, and they're not re-examining it, that should tell us something, I would think. But anyway, thank you for your testimony.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? No?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No, all set.
No, I guess we're all set, and thanks a lot, Kadeen. And Max, I know you jumped in there when we were talking. Is there something that you would like to add to this discussion?
No, I was just here really to support Katie, and if there's any technical type questions for the risk assessment process. I appreciate this meeting. It seems like there's more practical experiences, which I definitely appreciated learning by attending. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I guess do we have the audettes on now?
Yeah.
Oh, there's Murray. Good morning, Murray.
Good morning. I'm
So,
ready to go.
You want to tell us a little bit about farming without treated seeds?
Yeah, certainly not my favoriteest subject, but my family sat down and decided, you know, you need to just let people know what it's like for us with the boots on the ground, that, you know, what your decisions you're making will affect on the decisions the investments and the decisions that we make and have been making to get to where we are today. So first of all, my name is Marie Audet. I'm from Blue Spruce Farm and Audet's Cow Power, located in Bridport, Vermont, and we're raising our 4th generation of humans, a total of 21 family members, and still growing. So we have plenty of motivation to be here with you folks and to care for our land and to care for our animals and preserve our farm for future generations. We grow 1,400 acres of corn and 2,600 acres of hay to feed our 1,500 registered cows and about the same number of young stock. I'm going to do my best. I'm not an expert like you heard previously, but I'm going to do my best to connect the dots to illustrate how this piece of technology fits into our continually improving closed loop farm system. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, but I think we in agriculture are constantly upping our game to meet all these challenges, a myriad of challenges that we're constantly facing. And right now our investments, or lately our investments, are really reflecting some of these challenges, because what we've been making, the investments we've been making are in our fields. There have been investments in our cropping, focusing on protecting and improving our soils through a more gentle, regenerative agricultural practices. Organic matter has a profound influence on soil properties and structure, as we all know, and it's measurable, and it serves as a great indicator in improving soil health. Healthy soils are more resistant to the major rain events and by nature sequester more carbon. So in lieu of more traditional equipment you would have seen on our farms 5 to 8 years ago, today you will find no-till corn planters, no-till drills to plant our seeds, DAF system, which is a dissolved air flotation system that separates 70 to 70%, 75% of the phosphorus from our digested manure, allowing more precise application of phosphorus. You'll find manure injectors, putting nutrients into the soil, not on top. We'll find a brand new vertical tillage tool. We've only had, this is our second year, lovely new tool that allows us to fill in the cracks that we had in Addison County clay by just doing the first couple of inches on top, and we'll also kill some weeds while we're doing it. We're investing, and have been for several years, in floating tires so that we can protect our soil structure as we go over our land. So we've been all in in protecting our farmland and ensuring that food security we keep talking about for our region at a time when other parts of our country that we currently depend on for food is drying up. So how and why are neonics important to us? These same regenerative practices, the no-till, minimum till, cover crops, are actually increasing the risk of higher insect pressure on our plantings. Sequestering carbon in soil attracts insects. Conventional tillage, it used to disturb and bury the insects at a greater depth and lowered the risk, but we're not going back to conventional tillage any more than we're going to go back to spraying entire fields. So our integrated pest management, it starts below the ground. Once the corn is planted, the seeds have to survive 2 to 3 weeks. There's no rescue in that time. Seedlings, insect damage is an extremely high risk. Seedling damage is not simply yield reduction or of just a ton or two, it is 100% loss. It's different than the scouting we do all summer long after the crop is growing to look for insects and pests. On our farm, we have success in using half the rate of the industry standard of neonics at 250 rate. Combined with an insecticide, we are able to achieve reliable results. Our seedlings need protection for those 2 or 3 weeks after planting, specifically from, and you just heard this, but I have it down too, wireworm, white grub, back cutworm, fall armyworm, and seed corn maggot. These insects are in the soil and they're not easily visible. And let's not lose sight that we are at a time when our focus is on growing more of our own feed. We want to import less nutrients from outside the farm. And this last year, we were able to do a lot of that by harvesting snaplage, that's snapping and grinding only the ear of the corn to replace what we imported as cornmeal. We're constantly talking about what's the next crop we're going to grow. we ask that you do consider the unintended consequences to taking this tool away, because it does upend our entire system we've been working so hard to build. It's at the same time, it's not difficult for us to feel for our beekeepers. It's scary what they're going through. And I asked our agronomist, what could we do to help? And he pointed out some farms are adding a low-growing clover to provide forage for the bees. That grows low and remains after harvesting. I can see how that could help, because unfortunately, when we have a successful legume or hay harvest for dairy feed, we have to harvest it before there's any flowers. So once the plant flowers, it quickly drops in quality for our feed. We would lose protein, we'd lose digestibility. So low growing forage seed is possibly something we could do. Just trying to come up with things we could do to help. I really thank this committee and others for your thoughtfulness in hearing this issue from all of us who are affected. And we care about our impacts and approach every facet of our business with care, with the support of the latest available data, and that is supported by science. And thank you for hearing me today.
Yeah, thank you, Marie. There are questions for Marie?
I do have a question. Marie, nice to hear from you. Always thoughtful testimony. You mentioned a concern that we were taking this technology away from you. We just started looking at this bill, came over from the House recently, but as I look through the language, it's not contemplating a ban at all. It's empowering the agency to figure out if there are required best management practices for how to use treated seeds. And so I guess I'd be curious, it's very clear you would hope to be able to continue to use them. Do you think it's inappropriate that the agency would have a look and consider some scenarios where we may not find it appropriate?
Yes. And thank you for pointing that out, Senator. When we started hearing about what was the discussions in Montpelier, I probably could have adjusted that line right there, because it has evolved to a way that is much friendlier, I think, to how we use it.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. That's helpful.
Hey, Marie, what was the new piece of equipment you said you purchased that this is only going to be your second year of using? What was that?
It's a vertical tillage tool. So when, how you hear about these big cracks we get in our soil, and that happens even with no-till, sometimes you just have to refill in the holes, or suppose you've been on the field and it was wet and you're left with some tire tracks, but we don't plow anymore to ever fill those in. So we were left with an issue. And we've employed this tool, and it just kind of scrapes a couple of inches off and, really fills in the little holes and flattens out our fields again. We've been super impressed with it.
Huh. Is that a rig a big wide rig you pull behind your tractor?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, 'cause I know up in Quebec, I've seen farmers up there using a rig that the big wide leveling tool that they go down through their fields with it. So it's similar to that, maybe.
Well, we used to use land levelers that we used after we had cut the heck out of the field. We'd plowed it, we'd harrowed it, and then we'd use a land leveler to flatten it back out. But we don't use those anymore because we don't get that powdery soil anymore to level out. So this tool actually will slice the soil just a little bit vertically, so that it will, when it rains, it'll kind of give it that opportunity to fill in all the cracks and so forth.
Yeah. Well, that's good.
Yeah. But without interrupting the root structure.
Exactly.
Yeah. Other questions for Marie? Yeah. No? Thank you, Marie. I guess we're all set. If we run into other issues that we need to talk with you about, we'll certainly get hold of you and go from there. So we have Charles with us from.
Margaret likes next.
Oh, Margaret's next. Well, we'll put Margaret on then. Morning,
All right.
Margaret.
Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. This morning, I'm speaking on behalf of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization and CropLife America. As you heard from Cubby, one of the issues that this bill brings up, and Senator Pearson is correct, what this bill has changed from is basically a ban on the use of neonics to requiring the Agency of Agriculture to, in very specific ways, develop requirements for best management practices using integrated pest management. You heard Cubby talk today about the fact that in their fields, through the Caring Dairy program, that they did a study. And even though they were very heavily scouting their fields, which is really not much of an option for a lot of dairy farmers, they don't have the labor or the expertise, that even though they couldn't find the pest pressure, they still had a 10% loss in production. So you can imagine that if they had scouted last fall and had not really found any pest pressure and had actually had a big infestation, those losses in general, and I believe I shared with the committee a study from New York on just seed corn maggot alone, that if you have pest pressure in a climate like ours, that you can get over a 50% loss of your field. And we've already talked about the fact that there's really not much availability of untreated corn. So if you couldn't prove that you needed treated seed, the availability of the types and varieties of corn seed that Vermonters currently grow because of our short season, we have cooler, wet springs, et cetera. As Marie pointed out, through all of our great conservation practices, we have increased pest pressures in the soil that we really haven't seen before. And so we don't have the science to back up how to properly scout for them or how to properly protect our seed from them. And so this very, very minute amount of neonics being placed into a seed treatment is a fabulous way to protect our seeds from all of these unseen issues. Untreated seed is available, but it's only available if you order it early. And in Vermont, we tend to harvest our corn crop later than a lot of other states because we get a later start. So we end up with a later harvest. And so it gives us less of a window, as well as the fact that we don't have people trained to do scouting. And we would have to be scouting basically the entire state at the same time because corn comes off your field within probably a 3 or 4 week window in the entire state. And there's no way that we would have the labor to go out and to scout every single field in Vermont to protect farmers from what is potentially a huge loss. And so what this bill does, even if it does end up requiring integrated pest management and requiring Vermont farmers to prove that they need these products, there's the potential that you're putting this huge risk on farmers for what we're not really sure is going to be a benefit for pollinators. And that's, in the US, we try to use a risk benefit analysis. And so you're placing 100% of the risk on the dairy farmer for potentially a zero benefit to pollinators. We know through the Agency of Agriculture, they've done a 5-year surface water monitoring study that shows that neonics are not moving off of Vermont farms. They've even done studies where they looked at the pollen that's coming on the bees' legs back to the hive, and they've tested for neonics, and they're not finding them there either. So we really don't have any evidence whatsoever that neonics are actually causing a problem in Vermont. What we do know is that we do have all of these early spring pest pressures for the seed corn. So you're putting all of the risk on Vermont's dairy farmers with potentially no reward for Vermont's pollinators. And as Marie said, I think the dairy community is very interested in trying to work with pollinators. We all understand their value and want to help them. And we understand that worldwide, insects and pollinators in general are struggling. They're seeing very heavy losses. I worked for Congress on the Senate Ag Committee in 1990 during the 1990 Farm Bill, and we had a varroa and trachea mite section in that bill. So that's how long these pests have been a problem. And the issue is we've never found a good management technique, especially for the varroa mite, and they're decimating hives. And it is a big problem, but not using neonics is not going to solve or help in that problem whatsoever. Maybe the most important thing I'd like to bring up is that just last year, we spent a ton of time, my clients and your committee and others, universally supporting the creation of the Agricultural Innovation Board to replace the Pesticide Advisory Council. The whole purpose of the Ag Innovation Board was to stop these kinds of policies and laws from kind of being piecemeal put together, ban one pesticide, require a certain practice. The Ag Innovation Board is supposed to look at agriculture as a global issue and environmental impact, and use science and technology to offer up annually, so every single year, new policies potentially to the legislature and to the Agency of Agriculture. But what they're supposed to be requiring is the use of science. And so the Ag Innovation Board, as Clara Eyre said, she's a new member of that board. They've only met once. They're about to meet again. Their whole charge for this year is treated seed. And so here's the legislature basically tying the Ag Innovation Board's hands by requiring the agency to use a very strict set of criteria to set up best management practices, when just last year you set up the Ag Innovation Board to do that exact work. So you're basically, you passed a bill to get away from kind of this piecemeal legislative policy look at agriculture in Vermont and the environment, and now you're not using it. So our strong push is allow the Ag Innovation Board to do their work. I do think that the second part of this bill, where they're getting the state of Vermont to look at pollinator health, get a baseline, find out what the issues are, work with the agricultural industry to find out, are there ways that we can help pollinators potentially by growing some of these low growing cover crops, et cetera, that would provide some early season forage. From what I understand, most of the losses that beekeepers are seeing are that their hives are not overwintering. And so I don't know that it's an early forage, lack of forage problem, but there may be other ways that we could help. Climate change in combination with all of our conservation practices, as you've heard our farmers talk about, you've heard Cubby talk about it, are really changing the environment on every single Vermont farm. What we are finding is that our soils are completely different than they used to be. We're increasing organic matter in the soil. We're increasing air availability, space in the soil. That provides water retention, which is great. It also provides more room for roots to grow, which is great. But it also provides a fabulous harbor for new pests and insects that we haven't seen before. And that's not always negative. Sometimes those are positive pests and sometimes those are negative pests. But we don't have the science to understand exactly what's going on under our soils because it is so rapidly changing in Vermont. Vermont is leading the nation on these conservation practices, and the science just hasn't caught up to what Vermont farmers are doing. And so that's really why we would like to leave all of these decisions to the Ag Innovation Board. Give them the year to do their work. There's going to be zero impact to pollinators if you just give the Ag Innovation Board the year to look at the science, develop the studies that need to be done so that we know how to do this work. Every farmer uses integrated pest management and best management practices. But as Mr. Bordeaux said very, very clearly, that even with scouting, they didn't see pest pressure, and yet they had a 10% loss. And as everybody here knows, inflation is hitting agriculture just as hard as everywhere else. And yes, milk prices are up, and that's fabulous, but our cost of inputs have basically tripled, and the price of milk has basically gone up by 15%. So they're not kind of staying with each other. And with all of our conservation practices, what we don't want to do is go back out in our fields again. As Marie said, farmers are even starting to use flotation tires. We really want to restrict tractor traffic across the fields, not only for soil compaction, but for climate change. You don't want to be using those fossil fuels on your farm. We want to be reducing all of those inputs. And the tiny amount of neonics that are on these seed treatments is one of the ways that we can really protect Vermont from increasing climate change that we have seen dramatically in Vermont. We've seen an extended growing season. We've seen an incredible increase in water events, rain events. Not only are we getting more rain, but we're getting them in shorter periods of time. So we're seeing a lot of changes. And as I said, the science is just not keeping up with some of these changes. And so we ask you to consider to just do the second part on pollinators, try to get a healthy baseline for where pollinators are, ask the Ag Innovation Board to continue working on this issue. And as importantly, find ways that dairy farmers and others in Vermont can work with the pollinator community to maybe add some new practices that can help pollinators in some way if we know what those might be. So thank you for your time this morning, and I'll take questions.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. Are there any questions for Margaret? No. I guess, no questions, Margaret, but thanks again, for your time. Charles, are you ready to come on?
I'm here. Can you hear me and
Yeah,
see me?
good to see you. Yes, welcome.
Thank you. Well, what's that?
It
I
was
just
some
lost you, I think.
feedback.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well, you certainly heard one side of the story this morning. And I'd like to talk a little about the other side of the story. You've heard a lot of science from industry, and there is a lot of science on the other side of this argument, in the thousands of peer-reviewed studies that show the detriment of neonicotinoid pesticides to pollinators, to birds, fish, and basically the general ecology of our soils and all the insects that are beneficial out there that they're destroying. I do want to say right up from the start that as a beekeeper, I strongly appreciate the innovation of our Vermont farmers and our dairy farmers, and we are not working against each other, and I never want to appear to be working against them. But I think it's important that they understand the negative aspects of this practice of neonicotinoid seed coatings or systemic seed coatings. And in the bill, you're referring to just treated articles. And I think that I want to go over the bill before we're finished here, because there's some language that I don't think is really accurate in it. It's been changed quite drastically from the original bill. And I am not for, a type of ban. The problem with these treated article seeds is they were given this clause of being a treated article, which is a stretch on that language in itself, because it's the seed is growing. A treated article is something to protect a telephone pole or your winter jacket. But anyway, it was a stretch of the language. The problem is extensive here. We talk about all these pressures on bees right now, all this graph of all the list of things that are pressuring bees. When those pressures really started in earnest was right when these seed coatings started to be used. Okay. And I think it's really a misunderstanding to think, oh, we're only treating 1% of the field now with these neonicotinoid seed coatings. The problem with these seed coatings is that the plant absorbs 5% or less of the product on the seed. 95% of the product on the seed stays in the soil. There's been studies that show it's incredibly detrimental to the soil, killing earthworms, beetles, some very beneficial insects to the soil. And that's a detriment to the farmers. And I don't think they see that. I'm an insect farmer, so I'm seeing the detriment from this. But the problem is that when these are water soluble chemicals, they're highly toxic. When people talk that they were less, they act like they're less toxic than the organophosphates we used in the past. They're 400 times to 1,000 times more toxic than organophosphates when you look at toxicity and weight. Okay, so these chemicals then are water soluble and they're spreading outside of the field, and they're going into other plants and other places. They're going into our water. And it's not true that they haven't been found in water in Vermont. I have a list right here from, I think it's 2013, showing where these have been found in Vermont and so on. We have found these in pollen. We found these in in water and soil and so on. And the way these are getting to our bees is that they are leaving their area where they were planted. Now, you might be planting 1% of the field, but the field, these chemicals are leaving the field and going into other plants and adjacent fields, and they are spreading, and that is how bees are picking these things up. There's sublethal effects caused by bees, and they're cumulative. The bee may not pick up a lot of pesticide each day. It's not going out and getting killed from one flight to a toxic plant, but it's coming back with these neonicotinoids in the plant and feeding them to its brood and raising them and causing sublethal effects. We are not just losing bees in winter anymore. We are losing bees all year long. And that is something we never saw. I'm an old enough beekeeper that I remember the 80s and 90s, okay? We had beehives that lived literally 25 years. And we know that because they were in an odd spot in the bee yard, you know? And that bee yard, we realized, was there for 25 years. The bees would requeen themselves. They would go on seamlessly, okay? We are hard pressed to keep a beehive alive 3 years. Some we can't keep alive a year, some we can't keep alive 2 years. Now, it's really convenient for the chemical industry that mites came along, not exactly at the same time, but relatively at the same time that these neonicotinoids were introduced. Apparently, varroa mite was in France for 19 years prior to neonicotinoid use. Okay, they were considered a nuisance. When neonicotinoids, this all started in France when neonicotinoids were first used, and French beekeepers lost 50% of their bees the first year. And they drove their tractors down into Paris. Okay, this is the impact. There's thousands of peer-reviewed studies showing the detriment to pollinators and to the ecosystem in general. There's decrease in bird populations. That's caused in two ways. The major way is that it's decreased bugs dramatically, bugs in general. So these bees don't have the food, or these birds don't have the food they need. And songbird bird populations have plummeted 70, 80, and 90%. This is recorded in different areas of the world. I don't know if we have these figures in Vermont or not, but these are where, this is dramatic, okay? Hatches bug hatches in water for trout and things. This stuff is found in water all over the country. Whether we're able to find it in Vermont in such a dramatic way, or whether we've been looking as much in other places, I don't know the answer to that. But this idea that this is an integrated pest management approach is also a huge stretch. How is this integrated pest management? This is a prophylactic use of a pesticide, and it's a pesticide application, even though that status has been taken away by it being considered a treated article. So, I can send you a number of studies. I can overload you with studies. I think it's important that you see the other side of this picture and the impacts of it. And I think it's important that Vermont dairy farmers see the impact this is doing to their soils. There was a big soil study done, and they were shocked to see what this was doing to the soils, to the insects in the soils. We are the beekeepers now. It's, varroa mite was around before these things and was a nuisance, and we were working on it. The problem right now is that the bees are so weakened by the poisons they're picking up in the environment that they cannot overcome varroa mite. It's very different to be farming insects than it is to be farming mammals. But the way insects overcome their stresses and their problems is they evolve out of them. they uh, they they breed over time, and they evolve out of their problems. Tracheal mite, we bred out of in 3 years. Okay. Nosema cerana, we bred out, took a little bit longer. We bred our bees out of that. Right now, the bees are not evolving. We're not getting supersedure. And that's when a queen, when the bees replace their own queen. So we're getting a beehive to live the lifespan of a queen, one queen, where normally they would supersede and live, like I said, on and on and on for years, inevitably. The problems we're having are dramatic, and it's really important to address this problem and to do something about it. Now, neonicotinoids scientifically have been shown, and these seed coatings, that they are a big part of this problem. I think it's interesting that, I don't know if I can call it, thymothoxam is considered low risk when it's also, you can look it up, acutely toxic to bees. Okay, so the EPA approves these things and we don't talk about the results. Look at the labels. All these things are acutely toxic to bees. Acutely, they're very toxic to bees, and they're causing huge problems. They're causing huge problems in a managed industry. Our whole bee industry has flipped on its head in the last 20 years. All these things, all these problems have just exasperated in the last 20 years beyond belief. And you talk about cost. I mean, cost increases have just gone up ridiculously in our world. And you have to understand another thing. Our benefit to agriculture is not our production of honey. Okay, our benefit to agriculture is not, the money, the sales that I make or the other beekeepers. We're a pretty small industry in that way, but our benefit to agriculture as a whole is huge. And my father always said to me, you don't have to explain the benefit of pollination to dairy farmers. And I believe that's still true. And I really think it's important that we work together to resolve this issue. This is not low impact to pollinators. This is high impact to pollinators, and there's a lot of science out there to prove it. There's, going to this, I'm going to go to the bill shortly because I don't want to forget this. The one thing, there's this idea, and it's been, talked about here, to create a, where is it? Second. She'll monitor, manage pollinator health to establish pollinator health benchmarks for Vermont. How can we, in the middle of a disaster, establish benchmarks for managed pollinators? Now, if you wanted to establish benchmarks, we can go back to the 80s and 90s before these things were introduced. We used to, if we lost 10% of our bees in the winter, we thought it was a hard winter back then. We didn't lose bees of any significance during the season. This is how much this has changed. Now bees nationally, we're losing 40%. Some beekeepers have lost 90% of their bees. It's incredible. And the risk to agriculture as a whole is huge. Okay. We're not, are we speaking to berry farmers? I have bee yards on 3 different berry farms here in the Champlain Valley. All right. They're there because they're a huge benefit to those farms. We pollinate apple orchards. Other beekeepers pollinate more apple orchards. We gave up most of that. But we have to look at the whole risk of agriculture in the state. And this is a huge risk we're taking here. I mean, if you want to look at things, this is hard to see. It's kind of invisible. The cornfield's not on fire. but we have to look at the science and all the science, not just the science that's coming from industry here. And the science they're referring to, if you look closely, which I did, was all done by them, no third party involved. And when I listened to Mr. Bordeaux, and he shows a 10% loss in his study, I do hope that's third party reviewed, because benefit analysis that I've seen, and even the EPA has done one, benefit analysis of these seed coatings has been considered as little to no benefit. Little to no benefit, yet we're spreading it over, what was it, 96 million acres in the state? 92 million acres in the US are covered with this, and benefit analysis have shown them to be of little to no benefit. I think the benefit of these seed coatings have been very much exaggerated. And, you talk about loss. I mean, when you get, what do you refer to it as? Crops that aren't growing, parts of fields that aren't matured. I see that much more due to flooding in fields or due to drought. I don't personally believe there's a 10% difference, because that's the first I've ever heard of such a difference. And maybe it is, and I'm not saying anybody's lying. I'm just saying maybe it was in that study, but I think that has to be reviewed dramatically. I'm sorry, I didn't write a piece. I was told yesterday I'm going to testify. I have a lot of notes here. So we've covered the whole United States with this stuff, and beekeeping in the last 20 years, we're not beekeepers anymore. We're bee replacers. All we do is replace dead hives, and we do it by making nucleus colonies. And that's what I've been doing. And we've always done. But when you're losing 10% of your bees, to replace them with nucleus colonies is pretty darn easy. When you're losing 50% or more, it gets very, very difficult. And it's actually impossible. It's impossible to I used to run 1,000 to 1,200 colonies. This spring, I'm below 400 colonies. Okay, 2 years ago, I was over 1,100 at one time. I think it was 2 years ago, 1,140 colonies. We're in a horrible, horrible situation. And I'm talking about managed pollinators. God knows what the situation really is with native pollinators without somebody to manage them. And man, are we managing them. We treat for varroa mite 4 times a year. And varroa mite is a problem. But what I'm explaining is bees are never going to overcome the varroa mite under the conditions they're in right now, under the environmental conditions that they're living in. We're not going to be able to achieve that without reducing the environmental impact on them. And this, we're stuck. Okay, we can I treat 4 times a year. I use proven varroa treatments. We do the timing right. I understand the lifespan of varroa mite as well as I do bees. I've had to learn everything about varroa mite in order to try to fight them. But this is not, it's often the end result. Yes, varroa mites were there. They're in every beehive in the United States. So are the viruses. The viruses, some of them might be newly discovered, but doubtfully any of them are new. They are like I have the chicken pox virus because I had it when I was young. But if something happens to me, I'll rear up and get shingles. These viruses are popping up in bees because they're sick. They're continuously sickened. And we usually come out with a good, strong spring, and I feel positive. There's no stopping a beehive in May and June. And then we get into about July, and boom, bee populations start to fall drastically, and they start crashing. And I lost so many bees this fall before even packing for the winter. And when I was packing for winter, I was packing what I knew were dead bees. There were still live bees in there. I didn't have the heart not to pack them. I knew this spring I wasn't really disappointed when I opened up, found them dead, because I knew I'd find them dead. But it's, I was prepared, in other words. But our beekeeping industry in this state is in real jeopardy right now. From commercial like myself to hobbyists. I didn't really introduce myself. I don't know how many of you know who I am or where I come from. I'm Charles Mraz and then Champlain Valley Apiaries. We're a 91-year-old Vermont company here in Middlebury. My grandfather started it, Charles Mraz. I'm named after him. In 1931, he bought the bees in 1928. Our bees have been in Vermont, you know, we bred our own bees. We breed from our own bees, and it's very important. I bought in bees to my operation, and normally they pay for themselves, but they're dead by the end of the season. And it doesn't really pay for me to make work for myself. The best bees I can manage still are bees that I raise from my own colonies. I raised nucleus colonies this year to be production colonies next year. So we raise them up, we winter them, and then they're production colonies the following year. This practice we've done since 1928, literally. And this is a practice that has worked very well, and we built up great genetics over the years. And the biggest problem with this is that we've lost really valuable genetics. We had incredibly wonderful bees that were very adapted to this northern climate, that wintered very well, that did everything right, that were productive, and so on. The problem with this environmental contamination that we have out there is that these bees are the most productive bees we have are dying. The most, you know, they die from their own success, because the more they're out there, the more exposure they have.
We have a question from one of the committee members, Charles.
Yes, go right ahead.
Charles, thank you for your testimony. It's really interesting. I bumped into a beekeeper the other day, and I hadn't realized they were raising bees. And I said, "Oh, you raise bees?" And they said, "Well, I've killed a lot of bees," as a description of practice. So that echoes what I hear you saying. You talked about bees being sick, and you talked about sort of because of the environmental impact. But the discussion here is about neonicotinoids, and that's where you started. And so one of the things, as we've talked about this over the years, you hear from many is that, it's hard to pinpoint the decline of bee health precisely to neonicotinoids and precisely to treated seeds. And for somebody like me, I'm not, I don't have a lab, I'm not a scientist. We depend on hearing these conflicting points of view from people with knowledge, and then we have to make a decision. So what do you say to folks that say, it's not only neonics, it's not only treated seeds, there's a lot going on, and we feel bad for the beekeepers, but it's not fair to blame only this technology? Could you give me, what would be your answer to that charge?
Well, I rely on the science that's come out worldwide on neonicotinoids and their effect on bees. It's why the EU banned them. They didn't do it for no reason. And there's a lot of science out there, good science on what these neonicotinoids are doing to bees. And I've seen it in the field. We talk about, Syngenta talked about queen health. Well, the queen health has been blamed on neonicotinoids, the problem with queens. Okay, it's all these things that I read in these studies, I see in the bee yard. Okay, I see the effects of these things. It's an observation on my part, because I'm not doing the science either. I'm a beekeeper, which unfortunately we're definitely part scientists. So I'll say that, but I read the studies. I go to the national beekeeping meetings. I see all the doctorate studies out there. I see the pesticide studies, and these things have real impact. The science is 100% there. You haven't seen any of it today. You've seen science from industry only today. And I hope we get the people to testify that can show you the other side of the science. I'm not the best one to do it. I don't even know how to share slides on Zoom. Okay. And I'm sorry for that. I wish I had $1 billion team behind me, but I don't. And these people we're up against do, for sure. So, there's a lot of things said today that just, are misleading in a lot of ways. And I even think some of this reduction in crops in Europe that are they're looking at because of not using seed coatings. I think it also might be because of the commodities futures market, and so on. The fact is they can grow canola a lot better in Alberta and places like that than they can in Europe. So it's, some of this information is incredibly misleading and really should be looked into. I don't, again, want to take anything away from our farmers, but they got to realize that this possible benefit of using these things, which is a possible benefit, it has not been proven to be beneficial to crop production. Okay. There's been national work done on benefit analysis. Like I said, even the EPA did one. Little to no benefit to crop yield. And most of the crop yield benefit that I saw was for soybeans in certain pockets of the South under certain conditions. Yet we spread this, we've taken this technology, and in 3 years' time, I believe it was in the late 90s, early 2000s, this became of no use. And in 3 years, it was covering 90% of the corn and soybean seed out there. And this is the largest pesticide application in the country. It's the largest pesticide application in Vermont. It is a pesticide application. It's the largest use of neonicotinoids. Don't misunderstand that people are putting this stuff on the lawn and that might be the problem. Now that's good to take it out of, these things are way too toxic to have in anybody's hands. And it's certainly valuable not to be using them on our lawns and things like that. But this is a matter of scale. And, you'll look at graphs that are presented sometimes that say, that are comparing organophosphates by weight to neonicotinoids and saying, oh, we're using less pesticide and not taking the toxicity difference into account, which is just ridiculous. This is a huge change. It's been a huge dramatic change in our agriculture. We have to realize how large it is. And this huge dramatic change in bees corresponds perfectly with the use of these neonicotinoid seed coatings. Now, go ahead.
Well, just a follow-up. Did the bill that passed the House, is it adequate? Is it strong enough? Is it do you have thoughts on just, maybe not the wording so much as the concepts? Any faith that if it
we have something we have to work out here, because I hear the problems that people are talking about of, not being able to do the proper IPM in time and so on like this. But we have to develop a way, we have to come up with, is this necessary? Is it necessary to use prophylactically every year? year after year. This stuff is cumulative too. It doesn't just go away. It has long half-lives, okay? And that's one of the problems I think I'm seeing in my bees, is that this has just gotten worse and worse and worse over the 20 years we've gone through it. We've had some decent years, not so far in the past. We've done everything with our management system we could to counteract this. I look at this as something that, you know, is out of my hands in a way. But we do, as Vermonters, we have to be responsible for ourselves in the state of Vermont. You know, I look at the governor's agricultural report. Where is it? The you know, for the future of ag in Vermont and things. And there's a few things mentioned in there. One is soil health, one is water health, and the other one is the Vermont brand. And, you know, those are words on paper right now. But when you come to soil health, you know, not using these neonicotinoids, seed coatings, will certainly benefit soil health, because they are killing the soil. They are not doing any favors to this organic buildup in your soil. Now, we're doing all these innovative things to make our soil more organic and more carbon absorbing, and then we're killing the microorganisms in the soil with these pesticides. And that's a study, bang, it's done, peer reviewed. It's been shown to be happening. Water, it's showing up in water. You know, out west, they tested water where, believe me, the impact of corn is higher, but they tested water that had so much neonicotinoid in it, it would kill a bee if it drank it in a stream. All right, this is coming off the fields. Now, Vermont's a state and our agriculture is small. I mean, our agriculture probably, I don't know, 80–90% of it is in the Champlain Valley. But in the Champlain Valley, it's pretty intense here, what's going on with raising corn. And this corn is you know, it's getting nearly as intense as places like, you know, Indiana and places. So the other thing, the Vermont brand, you know, showing the world that we're doing something to be greener, you know, to do something about reducing these pesticides, about helping the whole system of ag, that's incredibly powerful for our Vermont brand. And we need to get out there and show that we are doing better. And I think that's extremely important. And this is a way to do it. We need to come up with a way to reduce this use drastically. And I don't believe that this necessity is really there. I don't believe this bug pressure is really there, as the people are assuming it is, and so on. Now, the bugs are there, yes, but is the pressure really there? Is it really causing this much problem at this stage in growing corn?
Charlie, do you have any friends in New Hampshire that have hives and do bees?
I have friends all over the country that have bees.
Well, we know that, you know, New Hampshire, who's our neighbor, you know, they don't grow corn or milk cows or any of that like we do. My question is, how are the bees doing in New Hampshire compared?
I have to admit, the only beekeeper I know in New Hampshire is right on the border with Vermont. I wish I could answer that. But the one thing, when you don't have agriculture, and this is why, you know, I want to make it clear, I'm not an adversary of our dairy farming. We don't have beekeeping without dairy farmer, without growing of hay. Okay, so that's something New Hampshire lacks as well. They don't have the agriculture we have, and they don't have the beekeeping industry we have. There's, you know, primarily hobbyist beekeepers in New Hampshire, and you know, here sorry, I lost my train of thought. We have, okay, so, most of our crop comes from clover, legumes. I shouldn't say clover, legumes, trefoil, all legumes, which are grown in hay primarily. And the hay fields are drastically important to us. The audits talked about the low growing clovers. It's Dutch white clover, and there may be others. This comes from a study I did with Sid Bosworth years ago. And I initiated it, called him, and it ended up being about a 2-hour long conversation. If anybody ever talked to Sid Bosworth on the phone, they know what I'm talking about. And we ended up getting the grant and doing a study on how we could improve forage for the bees, because over the years, we've grown much more corn than we used to, and a lot less hay. And one of the biggest problems is we cut the hay very aggressively, and I understand why. It's they need high protein content and so on. My best years, are when the farmers can't get on their fields because of they're too wet or something, so that they have to at least stagnate those cuts, and then we have more consistent bloom. But I was driving around one July and there was no bloom at all anywhere, except perhaps in people's gardens, and the corn was tasseling, and I was like, what can we do about this? And one thing I've always noticed was that Dutch white clover, after they cut, often, if the conditions are right, comes out and blooms beautifully, and it's a great bee crop. So we looked at different clovers and things that could be mixed into the hay. It was in the part of the study, I believe, was in the Vermont Farm Bureau publication. And I had a great reaction from dairy farmers, and I really appreciate it. A lot of people responded to that article and got out there and seeded down some of these clovers. And we have always worked together, where it's really, one doesn't exist without the other. Beekeeping doesn't exist without these farms, and these farms in the long run don't exist without bees. So it's very important that we figure out a way that we can both survive our problems. And these neonicotinoid chemicals have been very proven to be extremely detrimental to bees. And as a beekeeper, observing with my hands in these bees, daily during the season, I can assure you that my best testimony is what I see, and what I'm seeing and what I'm reading is these neonicotinoids are affecting these bees very detrimentally. And if we don't get this burden off of them, we're going to have big problems.
I think, we've had this discussion here in the legislature for years. And, we do this and then something else happens. We do fix that and something else happens. And last year, we actually set up that Ag Innovation Board, thinking that a group of people like yourselves and the ones we've had on testifying this morning could meet. We put no limits on how many times you could meet or not meet, and to try to, the people that are actually involved with it could actually sit around the table and come to some conclusion at some point that you could come to us with maybe a possible fix to some of these issues, so that we can all make a living here in Vermont and enjoy life. So have you heard anything in regards to the Innovation Board?
I have heard. I don't know if there's any beekeepers on it. I certainly think we should be represented if we're not there. I don't know who's on the Ag Innovation Board. But I think it would be quite horrible if it's filled with industry lobbyists. And I hope that's the case.
I
But-
doubt if that will happen, but
Okay,
it would be good if, you know, you or somebody from apiaries were invited to be on that. And then you guys hash it out and come back with some kind of a conclusion.
well,
Bobby, I can
Yeah.
speak, I can speak to who's represented on the innovation board if that's helpful.
They are, and they are,
She can tell you
So we have somebody from the Secretary of Agriculture. We have an active farmer who's a member of an organization representing the organic farming community. We have a member from the University of Vermont Center of Sustainable Agriculture, the director of the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, the director of the agency, oh, I'm sorry, and that was an agrochemical program designee. And then we have a director from the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets Water Quality Program designee, the Commissioner of Health or a designee with expertise in effects of pesticides on human health, the Secretary of Natural Resources, a certified crop consultant, an active farmer who's a member of an organization representing the conventional dairy industry. So that's myself. An active farmer who's a member of an organization representing fruit or vegetable farmers, an active farmer who's a member of an organization representing grass-based non-dairy livestock farming, and a member of an environmental organization that advocates for policy regarding the management or reduction of toxic substances in the state.
so does that, where's apiary fit in there, Claire? You know,
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
which one of those categories does apiaries fit into?
You know, that's a good question, and maybe they need to be represented better. I can certainly bring that up in our next meeting. We are meeting, I believe it's either next week or the week after.
Well, I think it's important that all aspects have some representation there.
thank you for that, Senator.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah,
You know, yeah, I think it's extremely important too, if we're discussing these issues. And, you know, we in the end all have to work together to be successful and have a future in ag. But I'd say right now, our ag future is really in jeopardy. And my biggest concern is that this has just gone on and on and on. And with, you know, some changes that may have, you know, be better. I mean, they did do something about the dust off. The dust off of the seeds was a problem originally, but that wasn't the way the bees are getting the dust off. The dust off came up when dust rolled over an actual apiary and killed every beehive. That was what brought that, you know, to a head. And they industry did something about that. They reduced that. But these neonicotinoids, you have to understand, bees, you know, bees have been shown to contribute to row crop production 30 to 40%. Now we look, and I don't know if that corn is included in that study, but that's an interesting thing, is row crops are considered wind pollinated, okay? But you have to realize bees don't differentiate. Bees use pollen as their source of protein. It's not that bees don't go to corn pollen. They will. And corn pollen is full of neonicotinoids. Okay, these are systemic to the plant. They grow up through the plant. and they come out in the pollen, they come out in nectar. Corn, young corn plants secrete a water at the edge of their leaves. Okay, I forget what it's called, and somebody could bring it up if they know. But and that stuff that has been collected and is toxic enough to kill a bee if it drank it. Now, bees take advantage of their whole world. You know, if they find a drop of water somewhere that's closer to their beehive than another source, they're going to get the one closest to their beehive. If they're going to get pollen and there's no other source of pollen, they're going to go to corn. They need the pollen. It's their protein. They can't raise other bees without it. Now, I wish I could steer them away from corn because we know it's toxic, and soybeans because we know they're toxic. But it doesn't work quite that easily when this is spreading through water and soil and migrating out of the field. The idea that this is particular to the plant, I admit, I'm sure that was the original plan. But when 5% of the product is absorbed by the plant and 95% of it ends up in the soil, that's a huge fail, okay? It's a huge failure on this technology. And no, industry hasn't been able to deny that. That was exposed in testimony in the federal government. So this, you know, we gotta try, and I certainly want to work together with our dairy farmers. I don't want to take a penny from our dairy farmers, but they're taking a penny out of their own pocket too. They're taking a big risk using this stuff. We're really on the virtual, you know, I don't know how long I'm going to be able to stay in business, 91 years. And I talked to my 86-year-old father about this and he's got no answers. He says, man, until they do something about this, I don't know what to tell you. There's no light at the end of my tunnel right now. Where, you know, this is not sustainable. And I'm not going to mortgage my home at 56 years old to keep my business floundering and you know, give away my lifetime's work to you know, keep bees in Vermont for the benefit of the rest of, for everyone else. This, you know, this isn't only my problem. This is really all our problem. This is an incredible environmental impact. I really hope you look at the science on the other side of the story. This bird population plummeting, they're talking about fish populations. They're talking, it was in one of the big trout publications, there was just a big article about this. Okay, they're not seeing the mayfly hatcheries and hatch outs and things for the trout. You know, I hunted rough grouse in the valley all my life. I'm an avid hunter all my life. There are no rough grouse left in the Champlain Valley. I have to go. The only place I find rough grouse in Vermont is where there's no ag. Okay, and then I hear other testimony, and they've done science on certain partridges in other parts of the land and saying that these neonicotinoids has affected them tremendously. Some of these birds, and they find dead birds in the field. There's another way these seeds kill birds. Birds go out in the field and they pick up seed corn. They follow the corn planter. We've all seen it. Now, sometimes they're following the tiller and they're looking for worms and things, but these birds go out and pick up seed corn. Now, I don't think a rough grouse can pick up a seed corn or two and not get completely whacked. These chemicals are highly toxic, and they've done research on birds where they picked up these chemicals and they lose body mass and they miss their migration by weeks. And when a bird misses its migration by weeks, that's a dead bird in most cases. Okay, this is how these things are happening. You can find dead birds after, you know, in the fields after these things have been planted. These are highly toxic chemicals. Personally, I wish neonicotinoids never came into our world. I think we could have figured out another solution. I'm not, you know, not a big driver of banning them, but you know, the thing about neonics is they're incredibly toxic. And personally, I don't think they should have ever been left out of the lab. But anyway, that's not my fight here. We have to come up with a system where Vermont ag has a future. And this problem right now is really, we have to consider this. This is jeopardizing the future of agriculture in Vermont, okay? And the future of agriculture in Vermont's a lot of things.
Charlie, we still have one witness left, and so we've got to, should move on. We want to thank you for your time and double check that innovation board, if you will, please, and Claire's going to check on it as well. But we need to get to our last witness. Maddie, welcome.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Maddie, for hanging on. But floor is open for you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Senator Starr, and thanks committee members and everyone else who's testified. For the record, I'm Maddie Kemp, I'm the Policy Director at the Northeast Organic Farming Association of Vermont, NOFA Vermont. I think all the committee members know me by this point. I've been tracking this issue since 2016 when the legislature created the Pollinator Protection Committee. And I want to start by first clarifying, and I'll come back to the Pollinator Protection Committee in a moment, but I want to just start by clarifying the nature of that we're now looking at. I think there has been a little bit of confusion from folks testifying today about what the bill would do. And I think Charles was trying to point out, and I think Senator Pearson, you were recognizing also that this bill has been significantly changed from the initial version, which did propose a moratorium on the use of neonics unless the Agency of Ag created rules for their use. And that prohibition has now been removed from the bill. And at this point, really all that's being proposed is that the Agency of Ag adopt rules for the use of untreated seeds, including best management practices. And from my perspective, frankly, the fact that those BMPs don't already exist is really why we've gotten to the point that we're at now, where these seed treatments are used on 99.9% of corn planted in the state. And so to respond to some of the earlier comments too, I just want to reiterate that treated seeds in some form and in some quantity might be a part of integrated pest management, but the way that they are currently being used now, which everyone seems to agree upon, is the opposite of IPM. The fact that these seed treatments are, prophylactically used on 99% of corn acres in the state cannot reasonably be called integrated pest management. In the EPA's words, as a first line of pest control, IPM programs work to manage the crop, lawn, or indoor space to prevent pests from becoming a threat. In an agricultural crop, this may mean using cultural methods such as rotating between different crops, selecting pest-resistant varieties, and planting pest-free rootstock. These control methods can be very effective and cost-efficient and present little to no risk to people or the environment. And that's the end of that quote. This is the approach used in organic agriculture by the 800 or so producers that we certify here in the state, and many thousands more across the country and around the world. This is an approach that sees pesticides as a last resort and instead relies on crop rotation, scouting, mechanical pest control, and other methods first and foremost in order to create an environment where it's hard for pests to sustain their population. And I'm just saying that to say we have other options for how to do agriculture in the state. And I don't take time and a lot of effort and probably a lot more labor to transition to those methods, just as it has taken time for the farmers that you heard from today and a lot of other farmers in the state to transition to a lot of the conservation practices that you've heard about today. And I argue that it's our job to support farmers in that transition in order to protect, beekeepers like Charles and the rest of our pollinators that, our food supply really depends on. Just like we have supported farmers in transitioning to cover cropping and reducing tillage, we need to also support them actively in moving away from prophylactic use of neonicotinoids. I just will reiterate also, we haven't really heard it today, and I reiterate that you hear from other experts who can share with you the vast body of evidence demonstrating that neonicotinoids are in fact harming pollinators. That's not really in question here, despite what some others have shared. The vast body of research demonstrating the impacts of neonicotinoids on pollinators is absolutely applicable here in Vermont as well. There's no reason that the impacts would be different here. So, and then in response to also some others' comments about leaving this up to the Ag Innovation Board, I really feel the need to remind you the legislature created the Pollinator Protection Committee to study these exact issues in 2016. And that committee did come back to the legislature with recommendations for rulemaking by the Agency of Agriculture to protect pollinators from the impacts of neonics. Those recommendations were made and presented to the legislature a full 5 years ago in 2017 and have not been acted upon, at least for the most part. We really don't need to wait another 5 years for the Ag Innovation Board to make the same recommendations. And I would hate to see what happens to businesses like Charles in that 5 years where we do potentially a lot more nothing, honestly. So, and to share a couple of the studies that have really confirmed the impacts of neonics on pollinators, there was a recent literature review in Massachusetts conducted, at the behest of their legislature in December of 2019, and a report by Cornell in 2020, which basically confirmed, and I'll just share broadly because I would love to have, other expert witnesses and scientists come in and share more details, but basically both of those, that lit review and that Cornell study, confirmed the seed treatments are harmful to pollinators and other wildlife. They are generally not increasing yields or providing major benefits to farmers, and they are being used incredibly widely with no regard to whether they are actually needed to combat a specific pest problem. The specific impacts of these pesticides are really well understood. The studies have shown impacts like a lot of sublethal effects, like reduced body weight, inability to navigate, shortened lifespan, reproductive harm. And I really think that those types of sublethal effects, even though they may sound in theory less harmful than outright bee death as a result of these, as a direct result of only this factor, I think that these should be really alarming to all of us. When we have overwhelming evidence demonstrating that pesticides are harming humans in these sublethal ways, I would hope we would take action. And in fact, the federal government has recently prohibited the use of chlorpyrifos on food crops, which was found to have neurotoxic effects in children. And I'm not suggesting but we know they're highly toxic to pollinators, which are the building blocks of our food supply. We really need to start seeing pollinators' health and our health and the ability to feed ourselves as inextricably linked. We should absolutely be caring about bees and beekeepers as much as we care about farmers and vice versa. And on that note, I really also feel like it's kind of clear what we need to do. I think we need specific action to limit the use of neonic-treated seeds to the context of a specifically identified pest problem. And that basically would mean implementing legitimate integrated pest management. This approach can help us shift away from the pattern of replacing a toxic pesticide with an even more toxic pesticide, which is often sort of the concern that we hear in response to the idea of getting rid of a tool like the neonicotinoid. So the second thing is that we need to do is support farmers in shifting to actual IPM from the prophylactic use that has become current accepted practice, and support farmers in sourcing untreated seed. And then finally, we need to require the rulemaking was recommended to implement IPM. That was recommended by the Pollinator Protection Committee already a full 5 years ago, as I mentioned. And I just want to say a couple more things in response to the concern about Vermont as a very small market for untreated seeds and the lack of availability of untreated seeds right now. It really reminds me of the argument that we heard years ago around Vermont's GMO labeling law. Right? We heard repeatedly in response to our GMO labeling law that companies were not going to change their labels just to sell products in a small state like Vermont, that companies were going to pull their products from Vermont shelves. That is not what happened. What happened instead was that companies labeled their products for consumers here in Vermont and then ended up labeling them around the country because it was easier. And we, all of you probably saw food packages with the words, produced with genetic engineering, on the label. And so I think what I would love to see is Vermont catalyzing a similar shift for farmers that may want to source untreated seed or just seed not treated with neonicotinoids. That could start in Vermont and really also increase the availability of those seeds around the country. I find it really, frankly, unacceptable that just 99% of these seeds are treated with neonics that are really doing significant damage to a portion of our farming population and to our pollinators. And we're just accepting that as a fact that can't be changed. So again, while I understand that the Ag Innovation Board was created to address similar topics to this, the legislature already convened a specific advisory committee that did include representatives, from the beekeeping industry, as well as dairy farmers, agronomists, a lot of the same folks that are on the Ag Innovation Board, or at least the same representation. We have their recommendations, which I'm happy to share with you all if you need to take another look at those. And I would also just encourage you to invite the rest of the witnesses that the House Ag Committee has heard from throughout session. I know you all invited Dr. Samantha Alger, and it would be great for you to hear from her, as well as Judy Wu Smart. And I think that's the last thing I'll say. I guess I know that you're supposed to hear from Heather Darby, and I think that that's really important too, to hear sort of her perspective on this. I know that she in the House Ag Committee shared that she is trying to do a pilot project to really figure out some of these scouting methods that that I understand are difficult, and I think really funding Heather's her in figuring out how to scout for these pests, and also figuring out how to source untreated seed would be an effective and helpful step that you could take. And I just want to say, to Charles' point about like the economic benefit of beekeeping, and the sort of economic impact not being the most important service necessarily that beekeepers are providing. There in the future, if we lose our pollinators and species that are negatively impacted by these chemicals, and the science really shows that again very clearly, there is no amount of money or legislation that we can spend or pass in the future to bring them back. So once we lose pollinators, they are gone, and the pollination services that our agriculture, our medicine, and our functioning ecosystems rely on are gone with them. So I think that it's really that are this whack-a-mole approach to pesticides and chemicals and trying to reduce them. We really have to start rethinking our approach to agriculture so that we can actually protect pollinators and all of the people that rely on them in Vermont for the future. So thanks for hearing from me, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Maddie. Are there questions from committee members? Anthony?
Sort of a question. I just want to be reminded again of what happened 5 years ago, so I could be reminded of that. Which the board that made this, what the recommendations were.
Maddie, you're
so the Pollinator Protection Committee. Okay, is that better if I shut my video off?
It might be.
Okay, I'll try that. Let me know if you can't hear me. Yeah, so the Pollinator Protection Committee was created in 2016, and it included representatives from, beekeeping associations, the dairy industry. It had agronomists and entomologists and all the folks that you would convene in an advisory committee to address this issue. And they came back with recommendations as directed to the legislature in 2017. And their recommendations in particular directed the Agency of Ag to implement rulemaking to address the issue of neonics and treated seeds. And so there are already an existing set of recommendations from an advisory committee that the legislature created that just have never been acted on. So to then send this issue back to the Ag Innovation Board to sort of start over just sets us back further. And so I would just really encourage you all to take another look at those recommendations and take some action to implement them, which I think is essentially what this bill does.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Maddie. Any other questions? No. Well, thank you. Thank you all and for participating this morning. It's been a good discussion, and tomorrow morning we'll be taking this subject back up with fewer witnesses. Andrew Murky and Heather Darby. So, you know, if you want to punch in and listen, that would be great. So again, thanks a lot for your time, and we'll be working on the bill this week and next week, off and on. So stay tuned. Thank you.